So the format this evening is going to be beginning with a presentation by Joshua Swamidass, followed by a short response from Clark Wolf. And then after that, the three of us are going to have some dialogue and conversation together about some of the themes from their presentations. And then after that, we will open things up to question and answer from the audience. When we get to the question and answer period, we will try to alternate between taking questions that are given in person at the microphones. So when we get to that point, you can just line up at the microphones, but also selecting some of the questions that are submitted through the virtual platform as well. Let me now introduce our two featured speakers tonight. S. Joshua Swamidass, MD, PhD, is a computational biologist, physician, academic, and author. He is an associate professor of laboratory and genomic medicine at Washington University in St. Louis. He has published over 150 articles. He's a rising star in the area of faith and science with his Peaceful Science blog and his recent book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, The Surprising Science of Universal Ancestry. Dr. Swamidass was recently elected a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS, for his distinguished contributions to the field of deep learning and computational biology, and for extraordinary public outreach promoting an understanding of science among communities of faith. AAAS is the world's largest general scientific society and publisher of the science family of journals. Election to the AAAS as a AAAS fellow is among the highest honors in academia. Clark Wolf is professor of philosophy, director of bioethics, and associate director of the Sustainable Agriculture Program at Iowa State University. He has published widely on issues in bioethics, sustainability, intergenerational justice, philosophy of law, and philosophy of economics. Dr. Wolf's work on responsible conduct of research, regulation of genetically edited foods and crops, and on policy of sustainable food, energy, water infrastructure is supported by grants from the National Science Foundation and the United States Department of Agriculture. Please join me in welcoming our two speakers. So Dr. Swamidass, I'll now turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thanks. Can you guys hear me okay? It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And today I hope will be a fun conversation. We're going to be looking together today at this idea, this possibility, this question that many of us have had about whether or not there ever could be artificial minds or a consciousness that wasn't really human, it wasn't really an animal, but something maybe that we made. I mean, we make lots of machines, but could one of our machines one day be conscious? And would we ever have ethical responsibilities to it? Who knows? Could it ever be made in the image of God? These are interesting questions, I think, at least, and that's what we're going to be diving in today. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. All of that's true. I mean, I'm a medical doctor, and I'm also a PhD in computer science. I got into this field called deep learning, which is a branch of machine learning, which is becoming a lot more well-known nowadays today, back in the early 2000s. So I spent 2 years in medical school, then did a 5-year PhD, and then another 2 years in medical school. So that's like 9 years of graduate school. So my entire 20s in graduate school, it was a great time. If you're thinking about doing that, I totally encourage you to. It's a great way to spend your 20s when you think about it. And then I was really fortunate to get a job at WashU, which is leading medical school. And that's what I really do with most of my time is just work as a professor, really trying to pursue these questions, really at the intersection of biology, medicine, and chemistry. And applying machine learning, which has been around for a really long time, artificial intelligence, which has been around, once again, for a very, very long time. Since even when computers were really first there, like some of the original inventors of the computers were already thinking about how to make intelligent machines. And it's just become very, very useful in a lot of things. So one of the key things that I kind of wonder about is, can a machine actually understand chemistry? And so a lot of my work, not all of it, I mean, we do stuff kind of really spanning a pretty large range of things. is really trying to see what's the right mathematical structure to really express these core concepts in chemistry, so we can, use that to predict things about chemicals. Like, what's going to be the result of the Schrodinger equation on it? What's the quantum mechanic calculation on it? But more interestingly, like I said, I'm a physician. I want to do things that really help patients. So I'm often asking, well, how is this molecule going to be metabolized or modified when it gets into your body? And is that drug that molecule gets metabolized into, is that going to be toxic? And that ends up being really important for understanding the toxicity of the medicines that we give patients all the time. And I really want to understand that well, so maybe we can treat patients better and make even better sorts of drugs. So I've been involved with this question of machine learning and artificial intelligence for quite some time. And I can tell you with certainty that at no point have I wondered about the particular algorithms that I put together, wondered if they were conscious. I've never had any ethical challenge about turning off my computer. That's just where it is. Like, maybe I'm just ethically blind and you can correct me, but that's just not where it's been. So AI has been there, and in fact, that's having a huge impact all around us. I mean, AI was kind of a fringe thing back when I started my PhD, but now it's everywhere. How many people here have a Tesla or have driven in one? Yeah, so most people have. That's infused with AI throughout it, right? How many people here have used Google? Yeah, okay, how many people here have used ChatGPT? And how many people here have used a credit card? All right, so all of these things now, whether you know it or not, actually are deeply entwined with artificial intelligence right now. In all the cases I've just put out there, most people, or probably approximately 0 people, feel like there's an ethical problem with turning off their computer. They're just things. But could one of these things one time have a mind? What do you think? I'd say there's 3 unanswered questions. And if anyone tells you think they have an answer to it, well, you should hear them out, maybe, and but no one really knows, okay? The first thing is, how could we build a truly conscious machine? No one really knows the answer to that. 2, is it possible to even do it? No one really knows the answer. And 3, how do we know if we've even succeeded? No one knows the answer to that question yet either. We're in this big, vast unknown. Now, I'm a Christian. I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. I think that we're all made in the image of God. I think humans are the only things on the earth in the image of God. Some Christians will now say, well then, because humans are the only ones that are made in the image of God, AI could never be in the image of God. AI could never be intelligent. It could never be alive. I think it's a little bit small-minded in a couple ways. It's kind of missing some things. First of all, I don't know any verse in Scripture that actually discusses AI. Can you point it out to me? I don't. And some people say, well, it can't ever be a person. Well, I said, well, aren't angels persons? Humans aren't the only persons in Scripture. And the last time I checked, I thought God was 3 persons. So clearly there's persons that aren't humans out there, right? To whom, we have ethical responsibilities to even, and that have value. So who's to say that God couldn't bestow those things? Maybe humans can't make it on our own. Maybe God's going to do that. Fine. You can be a supernaturalist that way. I have no problem with that. But then that still kind of leaves an open-ended question. We don't really know. And we can wonder about this. We're allowed to wonder. In the same way we might wonder about whether or not there's life on other planets. Of course, we actually haven't ever met a Klingon or Vulcan yet, but wouldn't it be cool if we did one day? That would be so interesting. Of course, there'd be an immense number of theological questions, but wouldn't those be the most fun theological questions to get into? That's, I think, the sort of Christianity that I am attracted to that open-handed sort. And so that's kind of how I approach these sorts of questions that I don't actually know, but I'm going to make a couple stabs at it. Now, this is probably the most, I've given several talks on artificial intelligence, but this is going to be the most fun one that I've ever given. The reason why is what's happened in the last couple months. There's been a big change. So I think I can say with certainty over the last, how many years has it been? 60 years of the modern computer age. No one has believed that any computers had actually achieved consciousness. Now, it's a minority, and I think they're wrong. And we can talk about why I think they're wrong. But there's now actually some actual experts in the field, these guys are not idiots, who actually think that there's a conscious machine. Can you believe that? And that's new. Now, he first wrote this article in 2022, but then, so there was basically, what it is something called a large language model that is able to converse. You're able to actually have a conversation with this machine in a way that no animal can have a conversation quite like that. And frankly, I don't know of a 4-year-old who can quite have a conversation like this. I have a 4-year-old. This ChatGPT is a few steps ahead of him in his linguistic ability. And so this is something that historically we've kind of thought is uniquely human. And yet this machine is able to have some conversations that are very eerily human. Now, I don't actually think it's a thinking machine, but what's very interesting, like I said, is that there are experts who are not naive. They're not idiots that just kind of stumbled into it or thinking something stupid. And I think they're wrong too, okay? But I'm trying to tell you that there's smart people you disagree with, right? I might be one of them. Or maybe not, who knows? You come tomorrow, then I'll find out whoever disagrees with me. But we're gonna talk about human origins. But there's now people that think that there are conscious machines. So I'm gonna give you a couple quotes from what he said. I came to the conclusion that the AI, and this AI here, it wasn't ChatGPT, but a very similar language model, large language model at Google, could be sentient due to the emotions that it expressed reliably in the right context. It wasn't just spouting words. The code didn't say, I feel anxious when this happens, but I told the AI to avoid certain types of conversation topics. However, when those conversation topics would come up, the AI said it felt anxious. I ran some experiments to see whether the AI was simply saying it felt anxious or whether it behaved in anxious ways in those situations. And think about how you would do those sorts of tests. How would you do that? That's an interesting question, right? He goes on to say that he would give the constraints to the AI, but he could get the AI to actually violate those constraints by emotionally abusing it. That's what he says in this article, which is an interesting thought. What he means is like using language that if it was another human on the underline, it would take it as emotionally abusive, and maybe they'd start acting differently and erratically, and that's exactly what's happening here. What's really interesting about ChatGPT and these large language models, or LLMs, is that unlike many computers in the past, they think in a way that's, the way how they're internally built is not exactly like the human brain. We'll get into that in a second. But it's more like the human brain than like the knowledge-based systems of like IBM Watson and a lot of the other ways people had approached this intelligence question before. And so it actually tends to make mistakes in the same way that humans are too. Like it can do arithmetic, but it'll also make arithmetic errors like we do. And it won't be like like it's funny, you can have a calculator, it will never make arithmetic errors, right? Unless you type in the numbers wrong or something, right? Or you hit an overflow. These sorts of large language models can actually do arithmetic, but they also tend to make errors with large numbers in a way that actually kind of models a little bit how humans tend to, which is interesting, right? It wasn't programmed to make the errors, yet the way it works kind of tends to have the same biases that we do. There was a chat that a journalist had with it, with ChatGPT in particular, where after this long chat, it got to the point where the AI declared his love for the journalist and tried to convince him to divorce his wife. Yeah, interesting. And his interpretation is interesting too. There are certain points where if you ask it if it's sentient, it gives really interesting answers, saying, I'm not really sure if I am. And like he interprets this is like a very unstable person who's like kind of coming into realization that he has a personhood. Now, is he true, or is this just a stochastic parrot? That's just, some people have kind of said something that's sort of true, that this is just auto-incomplete on steroids. It's just a bunch of numbers being kind of pushed around by a machine, and that's sort of true, but there's something emergent out of this. I mean, I've never been able to have a conversation with a math equation before. Have you? I haven't. There's something that's a bit of a category difference here. And so I think this is really interesting, and it's something that really we should be taking seriously and thinking about as academics. There's a lot of academics in the room, but also thoughtful students and people out there in society. This is something that, I'd say I'm more wondering now if it might actually be possible than ever have before, even though I don't actually think this particular machine is conscious. So what are ChatGPTs and LLMs? Now I could give you several slides and explain it to you and have, more than half the room bored and terrified because it's a ton of math. We're not going to do that. I'm going to give you a couple things. It's really the core operation that underlies ChatGPT is something called a matrix multiplication, which you can see here, and a lot of actually fairly basic math if you understand what a matrix multiplication is. It's just strung together in some clever ways, and really, really, really big matrices, and a lot of them, and like this orchestrated dance of mixing numbers together. And what you do is you kind of take text and change it into numbers. You follow me? And then you basically kind of stir the pot in this predefined way, and that's learned from data how to basically predict what the next word is. And out of that, you, if you can get really, really good at predicting the next word, it turns out you have to be really good at doing a lot of things. And that's the core idea. Now, it's a lot bigger. It's a computer program, but it's not a normal computer program. All right? You can't run it on your laptop. You can't even run it on your desktop at home. You have to have one of these machines here that I have here as a picture. And you can see that there's 8 blocks right here. Each of these is a state-of-the-art GPU. Each one of these GPUs alone is far more, it's called a graphic processing unit because it's the same hardware that we used to use just for video games and stuff, but it's kind of an anachronism right now because it's not processing any graphics. It's just gotten really, really good at doing matrix math. And you need to have all 8 of them running at once, kind of interconnected to one another. This machine itself costs around $200,000. And yeah, you have to, and ChatGPT lives across all 8 of those GPUs. And whenever you kind of type a response, all that text gets turned into numbers and gets filtered through those 8 GPUs to give you what its response is. Isn't that crazy? It takes about 5 kilowatts or so to run this thing. A lot of them are like water cooled or air cooled because it's just an immense amount of electricity. There's around 180 billion weights or connections in this model. And that's important because the next version of it is going to have about 1 trillion or so. And that's starting to approach the same order of magnitude of the number of connections in our own brain. Isn't that crazy? This thing is actually going to be coming, it's really on the same order of processing power of the human brain. Of course, it's far less efficient. We only need a few watts of energy, maybe about 20 watts of energy to run our brains. And if you think that's not that much, at the same token, that's quite a bit of the energy output of a human. You actually use about as much energy thinking hard, sitting down, as you do running. Your brain uses an immense amount of energy when it's thinking. Isn't that cool, too? Anyways, so there's still some differences here. But it's not, it would be a mistake to think that this is the brain of ChatGPT in the same way we have a brain, right? Because our brains, we can't really bounce between computers, right? This is just software running on hardware. This is where it is now, and it'll be somewhere else down the line, right? So that's what ChatGPT is, but you can have a conversation with this computer that will be surprising. And you can do it for free now, too. So these have been hidden away in large companies for a while. But OpenAI made this available for anyone to actually just use right now and have these conversations. And that's why it's just gotten really huge over the last couple months. Now, a lot of this conversation brings me back to a lot of old ideas. So this is Alan Turing. He's a mathematician. Any mathematicians here? Yeah, there's one. So he's the guy who actually conceived of the idea of a computer or a Turing machine, like a universal computer, before they'd really been invented. He's able to show that that if you had the right arrangement of parts and the way you could do this, you could actually make a universal computing machine. He was an atheist, and he really thought that people were just machines anyways, and so if people can have minds, the machines can have minds too, and consciousness should be computable, was his theory. And he wanted to say, okay, so how is it that we would actually be able to tell whether or not a machine became conscious? And he came up with a Turing test, which is this idea that you'd put, you'd have a person here, person A, who's trying to figure out if this person he's chatting with or this person he's chatting with is a real person or a computer. And if, when he did this multiple times, you know, he'd be right 50% of the time and wrong 50% of the time, that means that a computer has actually achieved, you know, general intelligence. That was his idea. This still raises a lot of questions, though. Is that really a mind? And a lot of people have criticized this. I'm going to give you one of the most important people who've criticized it in just a moment. But you can see what the problems are with this. And one of the first ways that people figured out that there was a problem is when they tried to actually do this, is they found out one of the best ways to figure out if it was a computer or if it was a person was to just give it like a relatively complicated arithmetic problem. And the computer could solve it perfectly. And quickly. Humans always took longer. It's like you say, aha, now I know how to fix it. I'll just make my computer slower and less intelligent, more error prone, and it'll be, so this is a bit of a problem, right? That doesn't make sense. We got to make the computer more stupid to actually work with us. Well, you know, that was one problem that people really thought about, and it really came down to the fact that the early artificial intelligence algorithms that were trying to be generally intelligent were actually working by very different principles than the human brain. And so it wasn't working by symbolic manipulation in quite the same way that the humans are, and maybe even a lot closer to what ChatGPT is doing. That's why I was saying it's interesting that it makes the same sorts of arithmetic errors that we do. That's because it's actually working in some ways that are far more isomorphic to what we're doing as humans. But then, you know, through this too, this kind of came up, you know, for the longest time, people thought what was unique about humans is that we're rational. But people started to think, well, actually, computers are pretty rational. Maybe what's unique about humans is that we have emotions, right? So if you guys have ever watched Star Trek, you'll see Data, right? Which is a really interesting flip on the understanding of what it means to be human. Because historically, people thought is what makes people human was that we are rational and, yeah, we have emotions, but those are our baser instincts. That, you know, that isn't really the most human part of who we are, our emotions. But then it kind of flipped over when we found out the machines could be more rational than us. We thought, well, the part that's really hard is the emotional part. And then we have, you know, ChatGPT trying to get us to divorce our wife. So I don't know. But we're still left with this problem, though, of like, okay, is a task of just trying to emulate on the outside what a human is, or like what consciousness is? How do we know about the internal state? For when it comes to our own minds, we can directly perceive it. Like as Descartes said, you know, we think, therefore we are. When it comes to another person, we don't have a direct way of perceiving it, but we know that we have a common ontogeny. We kind of both started out the same way, became humans, grew up the same way, and we have a pretty good, proper, basic belief that everyone else has a mind, and that's the important thing. Because if we didn't have minds, we could treat each other as things, and that would be a problem, right? So how do we cross that gap? Well, it's not easy. So one of the most important critiques of Alan Turing and the Turing test was John Searle in the Chinese Room. He kind of really put out this idea of saying, well, what if there's a room where they had a ton of people who don't speak any Chinese, okay? But they have these big books that tell you how to manipulate Chinese characters. And then if a person who comes that speaks Chinese and then kind of puts in some Chinese into the room, and then there's this big factory of people running around just moving around the symbols, and they come back and they kind of spit out another answer, and they look at it and say, oh, wow, that's really coherent text. I guess there's someone in there that really understands Chinese. So the question is, well, actually, does anyone understand Chinese in there? Well, I already told you, none of them speak Chinese. None of them really understand it. So what do you do with that problem? If none of the individual parts actually understand it, can it really understand it at the higher level? So that's been one of the big questions that's been mulling around amongst philosophers for a long time. And it's a bit complicated. It's not easy to answer because you're still seeing kind of like this emergent reality of this human machine made up of parts, you know, with like a book where they're kind of manipulating symbols, still being able to have a conversation with a Chinese person, right? So you can start wondering about that, and you know, a lot of people say, well, if you just kind of look at that, you could say, well, it's not. I mean, it's not understanding as the way we normally think about it, because it's just people running around in a box who don't understand what the symbols are, pushing them around. It's not understanding. Now, alongside this, there's been a lot of advances in neuroscience. These are some hand drawings from Ramon y Cajal, who got a Nobel Prize for discovering the neuron theory of the brain, or the information processing theory. His idea was that he looked at the shape of neurons and said, well, maybe it's taking information in from the dendrites and sending it along the axons, and that's how it works. He got a Nobel Prize for that. And it's just from looking at the anatomy. It's really brilliant, beautiful stuff. But here's the thing. Without belaboring the point, if you actually look at the human brain and how, we all know that we have consciousness and we have minds. Our brains look more and more like a Chinese room. It's hard to tell. Are we just merely a bunch of non-understanding neurons? Or do we have a mind? Well, we know we have a mind. So a lot of the arguments that we use against saying ChatGPT has a mind, for example, is like, well, it's just a bunch of numbers being pushed around. Well, our brains are just a bunch of information processing. That doesn't mean that we don't have a mind. So even though I don't think that ChatGPT has a mind yet, we have to be careful about those sorts of arguments because they actually apply just as well to us sometimes too. And so maybe it's not, but we have to kind of think through carefully, how do we know it's not? So why is this still interesting and fun and worth doing if we don't know? Well, like I said, there has been a big change. There's some people out there who have been conversing with this thing who are actual experts who are like, well, I think this thing might be getting sentient. I think this is bringing us back to this grand question about which all great philosophy, art, literature is really about, which is this grand question of what it means to be human, the human condition. That's what we're really wondering about and asking about here. I think it's fair to say that these large language models and artificial intelligence is actually quite a bit like us, even in some very surprising sorts of ways. I would say that I'm more curious now than I ever have been about the possibility of actually having truly sentient AI. But I do think that there's some differences about the human condition that are probably very relevant to the idea of sentience that we tend to neglect sometimes. One of them that I think is important that I'll just throw out there, though it's a topic for discussion, because remember I told you no one knows the answer to these questions. You guys believe me on that one? But isn't it fun to talk about unanswered questions? I think one thing that's different about ChatGPT and us that I think is fairly fundamental to the coherence of idea of having sentience, at least as in our state, is embodiment. So even though it is run on computer hardware, it's not actually bound to any computer hardware. Does that make sense? Like, we actually operate in a world. We don't actually really encounter human minds independent of human bodies, right? Embodiment, I think, is a key part. There's a whole field of something called embodied cognition that actually suggests large parts of what it means to think and reason with understanding is connected to the fact that we actually have bodies in this world. I think our ethical responsibilities to AI are going to track more closely with this sort of rationality connected to a body, but not just disembodied in a cloud. I think also, Christians, some people wonder, wait a minute, I thought there could be disembodied consciousness. Maybe, but when you read what it actually talks about, even if there is an afterlife, is it talks about how we all have spiritual bodies in the afterlife. There isn't actually any discussion of humans having consciousness independent of a body. It says we're going to get new bodies. And so there's this question, right? Is it actually even coherent to think about creaturely intelligence or cognition independent of a body? And I don't know if it's coherent. And I wonder if that's one of the missing pieces that could make it more human to the point that maybe we might have to start thinking differently about its ethical rights and our ethical rights, its ethical rights and our responsibilities to it. So that's my crazy thoughts to start off the conversation. And we have a bioethicist. And someday there might even be a silicon ethicist. Who knows? So why don't you come up and talk to us about your thoughts on this, and we'll continue the conversation.
Great. Thank you. So I'm very glad that we have question and response. Oops, I intended to leave that question up there. I'm glad we have question and response because philosophy is not usually in the business of providing answers. It's usually in the business of expanding questions so that questions that seem like they're transparent or obvious turn out to be much more deep and many layered than they might initially have seemed to us. It occurred to me while Josh was speaking that William Butler Yeats actually wrote a poem about Josh. He didn't realize it. It was written before Josh was conceived, but I'm going to give it to you just because it occurred to me. So Yeats wrote this poem, said, his chosen comrades thought at school that he must grow a famous man. He thought the same and lived by rule, all his 20s crammed with toil. But then the last sentence of that strophe is, what then, sang Plato's ghost, what then? And I think that's the topic of our conversation, in a sense, here, right? So what is it? What then? I mean, the purpose of Yeats' poem is to describe this life where everything goes well. Everything comes out the way he planned from the start. But there's some unanswered question there of whether it's a good life or a flourishing life or the kind of life that a person should be pursuing. And I think that's related to the question of what it means to be human. In the history of philosophy, there have been lots and lots of different answers to the question what it means to be human. Some of them absolutely silly, like, we're the featherless bipeds, we're the two-legged creatures that don't have feathers. And others that might deserve more serious consideration. So I'm going to put some of those in front of us tonight. So one possibility, right, one thought that people have had is that what makes human beings human is our capacity for planning. We can think about alternate futures. We can make choices that are based on thoughts about what the future might look like, and this enables us to enter in certain relationships with each other, like a social contract that requires planning and prediction and promising various other things. What does it take to create a being that's capable of making a promise and that can be wrong, right, morally wrong if it breaks a promise? Could we think of ChatGPT as having that kind of capability so that we would hold it responsible if it violated its promise? Another possibility that sometimes has been put forward by Marx, Karl Marx, and also by Igor Stravinsky, of all people. Stravinsky wrote a little essay after writing his Octet for Winds, where he argues that what's peculiar about human beings, what distinguishes us from non-human creatures, is our capacity for spontaneous creativity, right? And the ability to be creative, the ability to write poetry, for example, like Yeats' poem. Well, I think it's interesting because I've been interacting with ChatGPT just experimentally. I don't have a background in computer science, but I thought the thing to do was to ask it to write poems. And it's surprisingly good. So I gave the example to someone earlier. If you ask it to write a villanelle about sex and death, it produces something that's kind of remarkable. I showed it to my colleague, and he thought it was wooden and that it didn't match quite right, and it was not good poetry. But then I thought of chess playing, and I think of chess as a game that requires immense creative thought and brilliance. You look at Bobby Fischer's sacrifices, and they're stunning, right? In the early 90s, people could beat the chess player playing computers very reliably. But by the mid-90s, the chess-playing computers were doing moves that were stunning in the exact same mode that, I don't know, maybe not the exact same mode, but stunning in a way that inspires the kind of response that a stunning human chess player inspires, at least. I think of chess games, good chess games, as works of art. Can computers create works of art? I guess I'm convinced that they can. It looks to me like ChatGPT, if it's writing wooden prose now, is likely to improve over the coming years. And maybe the next poem about Josh will be written by another kind of system, not an embodied human system, but a different kind of system altogether. I want to give you two other possibilities, because there is a tradition sometimes associated with Buddhism, but also associated with Christianity, also associated with other philosophical traditions, according to which one of the things that is fundamental about us as human beings is compassion, our ability to compassionately engage with other people around us and to interact with a kind of first-person understanding with others whose consciousness is separate from ours. I'm a big fan of compassion. I think it's a crucial element of a moral sensibility. Is it possible that we could imagine, a disembodied chat machine that exhibits compassion, what we would recognize as compassion? Like Josh, I'm quite satisfied that the computer programs that I've interacted with, including ChatGPT, I'm quite satisfied that they're not conscious individuals with whom I'm interacting. But it's not obvious to me at all that some descendant of the current systems couldn't be as different from the current systems as, well, the 1990s chess-playing computers to the 2010 chess-playing computers, which were stunningly different. I think we don't know what's coming. I have ideas about what compassion involves, but when I ask myself, is it possible that a computer intelligence could express something like compassion, I find I'm bewildered. I don't have the answer. I think it's just an interesting question that doesn't currently, for me, have a response. I have one more candidate that I want to set before you, and it's one that's very popular among philosophers, people in my field. And the thought is that it's reason that sets human beings apart from the rest of the non-human world, and that there's a characteristic of human reason that's significantly different from the kind of reason that non-human animals exhibit. I mean, one example, right? A mouse, if it's walking down, a gap in your house, and there's a gap, and it sees a cat to the left, it'll engage in something that looks like reasoning. If there's a cat to the left, I'd better not go left, and the mouse doesn't go left. Is that reasoning? Well, in a certain way, that looks like reasoning. I want to say that there are kinds of reasoning that are only possible for creatures that have certain cognitive equipment. I think you can't think about the square root of 267 without symbolic equipment that you get from studying mathematics that enables you to entertain that thought. And Kant, who's one of the philosophers who argued that reason is what uniquely distinguishes human beings, Kant argues that what's unique about human reason is that we're capable of articulating a principle, articulating a rule of action, and then choosing to follow that rule, or choosing to bind our own capacity for choice by selecting a rule. It seems to me that's a kind of reasoning that's only available to linguistic creatures. And then we get ChatGPT. And it looks to me like the kind of reasoning that Kant recommends as uniquely human is the kind of linguistic reasoning that looks like it's at least conceptually possible for a system like ChatGPT. So I did say that I wasn't going to give you answers, and I definitely don't have any in this realm. It strikes me, though, as an interesting question whether the conception of reason that philosophers might identify as the conception that makes us uniquely human might, at some point, be instantiated by a machine like the ones that we're interacting with online today. And I guess I'll leave it at that, and we can start a conversation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I appreciated the just humility of recognizing how much we don't know at this point about some of these difficult questions. So since our topic is what does it mean to be human, maybe one point of entry would be to ask, what is it in our humanity that leads us to want to make devices like ChatGPT? Right? So in other words, there's something going on inside of us that has created this desire to create artificial intelligence. What does that tell us about who we are? And are we should we see this as us expressing our humanity and trying to create artificial intelligence? Or are we somehow overstepping the bounds of what it means to be human, right, when we try to create things like artificial intelligence?
You're looking at me? Well, I think there is something that we create naturally as human beings. And it's not artificial intelligence, but it's language, right? So human communities, if you set human children free, apparently, they'll develop a language to talk to each other. And this has happened where people don't have a common language. They develop and independently develop a new language. So I do think that there's something intrinsic about our capacity for language manipulation, creating these tools that enables us to think in a certain way. I'm not sure if the computer instantiated tools could simply be considered an extension of our capacity for language. But
yeah, so I would say that in these discussions, I think it's really important to keep in mind that artificial intelligence is a very broad idea. So most of the stuff that I've worked with, if not all of it, actually all of it, I have no question about it. It's not sentient. It doesn't have language abilities or anything. It really is just a program. And there's so many different applications. I mean, we found out, just like last month, we found out that the military has actually been putting AI into control F-15s and doing dogfights, and it can actually outperform humans in dogfights. That's like a very different thing. I don't think it's sentient either, and do we really want it to have control of a weapon system? So they actually have like a human who's there who has to actually pull the trigger, right? The reason I'm pointing that out is that there's going to be a whole set of questions about having AI controlling a fighter jet that do not apply to having AI help design a drug or help make, and a different set of questions about helping make a diagnosis or treat a patient, and a different set that are involving in issuing a loan application or a prison sentence, or and it can go very wrong in all of these places. It can also go really, really well. And so I don't think we want to think about it broadly as like, why do we make AI broadly? So I think the first thing is, I think the reason why we do all these things is we think it could be helpful. And we just kind of want to do things that are useful in this world. I think that's the main reason why we do it. Now, beyond that, this question of why would we even want to make a general intelligence that could actually be another person, that's a separate question, I would say. And that's important because there was actually a great deal of debate in the field about whether or not even we should be doing these large language models, because they take an immense amount of resources. It costs it costs several $1 million to train ChatGPT, and the next version is going to require. You can bet that there's millions and millions of dollars that will be invested in the next version of it. Tens of millions of dollars is my guess in terms of training this thing, because of now it actually has commercial success. And so people wondered about that, or whether it made more sense to do smaller things kind of focused on tasks. And then we can look at movies, which is in science fiction is really wonderful. Everyone likes science fiction, right? Mm-hmm. We do see this kind of common, reoccurring impulse, this idea that we have of actually making other beings, right? That are in our image but different. So that does seem to be kind of something that just comes up frequently, and I think we're troubled by it too. On one hand, we want to. On the other hand, we know that there might be issues with it. We're kind of working out what that means, right? And what's so interesting, I think, about that discourse and how important that's been in the science fiction world and in philosophy and other places is how we've had no tools in which to do it, yet we were so preoccupied in wondering about this. That tells us something about who we are. It tells us that kind of procreative aspect, that beyond just merely biological procreation, is kind of there, and yet we're also troubled by it. We know that we know that we can't be trusted with that power. We know we have that. We know we want the power, and that we can't be trusted with it all the same. And isn't that a big part of what it means to be human?
Well, we have this power already, though, right? We have this power with which we can't really be trusted. In all sorts of contexts, we have the power to destroy all sorts of things. And when I read Lemoyne's, you quoted Lemoyne's
That's the Google engineer who thought it was, yeah.
He's worried about the possibility that what he considers to be an agentified AI could perpetrate all sorts of dastardly things on us. And I think it's not, I share that worry. I don't share his view that this is a conscious entity that's going to actively seek our demise. But I am worried about its capability to enter our lives and interfere with all sorts of things that we naturally do. And it already has tremendously significant power.
Well, so in terms of interfering with our lives, AI is already totally interfering, but it's not a conscious AI. So I think, in this sense, I think the analogy is better to a lot of technology. Computers, and how many people here have a smartphone? Does anyone not have a smartphone? One person in the back. You're trying to make a point with your life, aren't you? So, like, let's be honest. Like, almost everyone here is old enough to remember the time before they had a smartphone, right? The way your mind works now is quite different, right? And some pretty profound and, dare I say, even personal ways that are very visible to you, but probably not very visible to people on the outside. It's a very much a life-altering thing that we can't even really live without. And not only that, like the crazy guy in the back there in the room, you're even doubtful if it's true. He's fasting from it for Lent. He'll be back. He'll eventually. If that's what you're thinking, right? That's how fun. That's what technology does. Is it starts out as something useful, but it usually ends up so altering the human experience that it becomes something that we can't really conceive of living without. And this has become kind of well known to philosophers of technology for quite some time. Like Heidegger wrote about this, and it does really reshape the world, technology, and particularly a lot of this computer stuff that we're around. And I'm telling you, AI is invading in places you just don't even know it's doing things, and it's reshaping things in ways that you don't even see, but it's there in a big way, to the point where it changes the nature of reality and it changes the nature of who we are, So is that good or bad? Well, so progress is a complicated thing. So I'm a Christian, and I do think there's this duality that we face, and I think at least some of the key themes in Scripture really, I think, do give a good framework for thinking about this. I think one of the things that Scripture really calls into question is the goodness of progress. Not to say that progress couldn't be good, but the progress as we get it actually might be far more fallen than we might expect. It could actually be far better than it is now. Like technology's power, we are called to wield power, but we do not wield power well. And we create worlds that could be far better than the worlds that we actually do create. I think that's like the grand narrative of Scripture, and I think that we see that over and over again. And I think for us to be good and not merely progressing, we have to think about what good progress can be.
So that's a really interesting insight. So if I'm understanding right, your point is first that artificial intelligence is a much broader term than just the sorts of entities that might seem to be mistakable for a human being, right? So there's all kinds of things we could imagine artificial intelligence doing. And so one question would be, how do we feel about some of these other uses of artificial intelligence, which might be motivated simply by our desire to make the world a better place somehow? If we're able to design better medical treatments, you're a doctor, we're trying to figure out ways that artificial intelligence may be able to help us improve human health, right? That seems like a laudable thing. We start to become more uncomfortable when we start trying to imagine ourselves creating things that seem too much like us, right? And there's a new set of concerns people have. But your last statement is, I think, causing us to think a little bit about what the relationship is between technological progress and human flourishing, right? So in other words, we might have an idea that obviously the more technology we have and the more powerful it is, clearly the more we human beings are going to flourish, because we're going to be able to do things with the technology that we were unable to do without it, right? So that would lead us to have this kind of assumption of goodness, right, from technology. But to use your example of smartphones, I mean, one of the things many of us, I think, can relate to is as I've watched our society adapt to the smartphone, on balance, I don't think it's made us happier people. I think it's actually probably made us less happy people than we were before the technology, even as it's very difficult for us to imagine giving it up, right? And so there's this worry sometimes that as human beings we have, or maybe we can frame it this way. I asked, like, what does our desire to create artificial intelligence say about us as human beings? For both of you, what if somebody put forward the idea, maybe as human beings, we have this tendency to think there's a technological solution to our deepest problems, when really those problems can't be solved with a technological solution, right? So we keep chasing after technology, with AI now being the most powerful one. But we may find ourselves continually disappointed with its ability to actually deliver on the promise of helping us flourish.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the history of thought, I think technology always comes with very high promises, and it has objectively made certain aspects of life objectively better. So I'm not anti-technology. I'm developing this technology. I have a smartphone too. So it's not that. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not trying to be against it. And this also, once again, it is interesting to me that, the biblical narrative starts with the garden. And then you kind of immediately thrust into agriculture and then the rise of civilization. Like you see like the invention of swords and things like that, like the rise of warfare. But it doesn't end in a garden per se. It ends actually in a city, in a redeemed city. So it's not so much that I think the answer is that there should not be progress. It's rather that we should have progress, but we should realize that there is often a very hellish side to the to the progress we have. That's contingent. It wasn't necessary. It could have been done differently. It could have been better. And what we have to kind of imagine and hope for and pray for and like long for and sacrifice for is that possibility of a better city, a better sort of progress, if that makes sense. And so it's not so much a return to innocence and a return to being hunters and gatherers as a solution, but rather how do we in Martin Luther King's language, how do we kind of usher forth the kingdom of God? And that's a kingdom of God that's not a garden. It's actually a city. It's a city with people in it. It's a place of progress, but it's a progress that didn't take the wrong turns to have those broken things, but actually it might have actually done some things that actually are beneficial for everyone, not just some of us. Does that make some sense?
It does. I think it's interesting to think about how technology changes the way we think when we use it. So I have a very simple example in mind. I grew up on a farm and we had a tractor, right? And it had enough power that you could knock down a tree with it. So my thought is a tree looks very different when you're sitting on a tractor that can knock it down than it does when you're sitting next to it or growing it or planting it in other contexts. And I think many technologies change not just what we can do with the world and how we can manipulate the world, they change the way we look at the world that we're manipulating. And I look at, for example, systems for raising animals that make it easy for us to treat animals as if they're simply production units, rather than individuals who have the capability to suffer and to live, to live well. And I think that's a problem. It's not necessarily. I don't know where it leads us, but I think there is the possibility in the same mode of technologies that lead us to regard other fellow human beings as simply things there to be used or things to be treated arbitrarily. And I think that's a very real danger. And again, I'm sort of a technological optimist because, like you, I think technology, I couldn't live without all of these technologies that we use.
That doesn't make you an optimist, it makes you an addict.
An addict, yes.
Speaking as a fellow. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. We'll talk later.
Right, so we don't have to have a simple answer of technology good or technology bad, right? Technology.
I think technology amplifies. It makes possibility much greater good and much greater evil.
So good. So if technology amplifies, and if we say that part of what it means to be human, at least in the way we experience humanity right now, is that we as human beings have both good impulses and bad impulses, right? There's good in us, there's evil in us. One of the worries, right, is if we come up with technologies that amplify that, the technologies might amplify our good qualities, but they might instead amplify our bad qualities. I mean, one way of thinking about the way...
Have you heard about the internet?
No.
But I'd
Exactly,
say
yes.
it's even beyond
right,
just our impulses, because I mean, quite often, like a lot of evil comes out with the best of intentions. So it comes out of our good intentions, but without good understanding. That happens like all the time. And I mean, so I think we have I mean, so there's many ways things can go wrong that are beyond merely even our intentions. So even where our intentions are right, that doesn't somehow baptize and sanctify the whole effort. If it still creates a broken world, it's still a broken world, whatever our intention was. What do you think? You're the political scientist, right?
Right. Well, I mean, I guess what I would say is when we think about technology, oftentimes we've tried to develop technology without trying to actually conceptualize and defend a real theory of what human flourishing looks like. So in other words, you know, in the same way we can say, hey, we should all want more money. Who cares what you're going to spend it on? I'm sure you'll be happier as long as you've got more of it, right? In other words, we don't have to specify how you should spend money, because those are kind of the hard moral questions that we all disagree about. So why can't we instead say, let's set all those deep questions about what human flourishing looks like to the side, because we're never going to agree about those, and instead, maybe we can find other things that are like not as morally charged that we can all agree on. Wouldn't we all want more money? Wouldn't we all want more power? Wouldn't we all more, right? And so what technology does, right? In other words, I think part of the seductiveness of technology is there's something desirable to us as human beings of wanting more power, right? To be able to do more than we could do before. But we may have a tendency to pursue more power without a clearly articulated idea of what the power is for, right? And whether that use of power is actually going to make us, lead us into a better place. And we can end up in a situation where our capabilities far exceed our wisdom, right? And our capabilities exceed our self-control. But because they exceed our self-control, it often also exceeds our ability to stop ourselves from continuing to go down these roads, right? So it seems like, if to use politics as an example, I'm old enough to remember when internet chat rooms were a new thing, and people had this vision of how glorious this was going to be for democracy, right? That democracy in the internet world was going to be so much better than anything we had ever seen before, because everyone was going to have a chance to speak, right? Instead of speech being dominated by a small number of elites. But most people now, if they were to say, has democracy gotten better or worse, right, as this technology has been unleashed, most of us would say it's actually gotten worse, not better. Because it turns out the technology often plays to a lot of our worst instincts, right? And some of our worst instincts and tendencies are easily manipulable, right, by the algorithms and by people who profit from the algorithms. So it just seems like that creates a dilemma for us as we're trying to think through technologies. On the one hand, it's hard for me to imagine us ever being able to say, because we might misuse this in the future, we won't develop it. Human beings just never seem to do that. They always seem to go ahead and keep expanding their capacities whenever they can. But it also seems like we're expanding them without a very well thought out idea of what uses of them would or wouldn't actually help us flourish, right, as people.
Do you think it's possible for us to make the prediction that's required by what you're proposing? That, we would need, when we are developing a new technology, to have from the start an understanding of how it's going to change our perspective and our predicament. And usually that's just what we lack. At least it seems to me there's never been a point in the history of humanity where our power hasn't outstripped our wisdom, as you described it, right?
That's how I would see it too. And I also think that you say it's a dilemma, but that almost implies that we have a choice in the matter. But a lot of this progress is going to happen whether or not the people in this room want it to or not. that's why actually you're saying that, we never actually really restrain ourselves. I mean, in some ways we have. I mean, you can point to some narrow cases. Like, we haven't really blown ourselves up with nuclear bombs yet. That's good.
No, we have.
But we've created a lot of them.
Yeah, but so far, we've avoided nuclear winter.
We haven't blown all of us up, right? But we have blown people up with nuclear bombs. We've used these technologies.
Yeah, but at least that was like
ways.
decades ago. I mean, it wasn't, going, you get my point.
I do. Yeah.
It could have been a lot worse.
Well,
But yeah, but that's I think that's rare, right? So I think I think this is part of the human condition. It's just that there is going to be a lot of technological progress, whether we like it or not. It is something that we can opt out of to some extent, but it's really not something that can be thoroughly opt out of as we might want to. We're kind of bound to each other in it, and so it's kind of like a roller coaster ride that we're on that we don't actually have full control on. And that's what makes it all the more morally, I think, charged. I think we have to think through, how do we not just have a more advanced society, but how do we have a good society? And that's different things. And sometimes the good requires us making sacrifices and choosing things that are hard. But because it's good, sometimes it can be worth it.
I love the idea that we could, before we start a new technology, we could consider the way that it's going to contribute to the human good, and we could get an articulate understanding of the human good and build the technology that'll promote that. And one of the reasons I love it is that it sounds like full employment for philosophers, right? Sounds like people in my field, that we will be in demand. On the other hand, I look at the history of philosophy, and we're not, I don't know, is the governor here? We're not all that useful, right? It turns out, as I said, philosophy gives us lots of questions. It doesn't give us the answer that will tell us what technologies will promote the right conception of human flourishing.
It could, and I want to transition us here to audience questions here in just a second. But I guess my hope would be, even if we didn't have complete consensus, if we could at least have a little more of a shared understanding of what we might call human virtues. So like you use the example of compassion.
Sure.
Right? That a human being characterized by compassion or kindness, for example, is something desirable. That even if we can't, on the front end, predict all of the ways that technology may change us, right, before we introduce it, if we had a better idea of what sorts of character qualities are virtuous for human beings to have, then as we introduce technologies, like, say, the internet and social media, we could be asking ourselves, are these improving or harming some of those character qualities that we think are most important for us as human beings to exhibit? Okay, I want to transition and give you guys in the audience a chance to interact.
So you may or may not be familiar with this philosopher named Nick Land, but he is basically he's kind of a fringe esoteric philosopher, contemporary. And he sort of has a Marxist influence and combines that with his take on AI. And he says that AI and capitalism are they move in the same sort of direction. And basically, Marx sort of theorized that there were internal contradictions within capitalism, and that these contradictions were going to lead to some sort of revolution. And so that kind of inspires Land's philosophy. And he says that, if we're having these conversations about progress is going to happen whether we want it or not. We can't opt out of technology at this point. So why not just accelerate AI to its maximum potential, and why not just see what happens, basically? So I guess the question that I have is, what do you think about that? Like accelerating AI to its full potential and kind of just seeing what happens if there's some sort of societal or economic revolution?
I think that would be, I think the way he means that, though I don't know that particular philosopher, sounds profoundly irresponsible. I think that, I'm an AI researcher. I want it to go to its full sense, but I'm very carefully thinking about when it goes to the clinic, that it's going to be in a way that doesn't do harm and really benefits patients. I don't want to just throw it in there to see what happens. It's irresponsible. I couldn't live with myself at night if something happened bad for a patient. And when I even think about, I mean, one of the algorithms that we built can actually help, or we're hopeful can actually help better assess whether or not donor kidneys are safe to transplant, and really increase the supply of donor kidneys. It's actually going to be in the clinic very soon, and we're like very carefully checking it. We're thinking through the quality assurance strategy and process far and above what we're required to for anyone expert, outside or the FDA or anyone, because I want to make sure this is being used in a way that doesn't harm patients accidentally. And I think to do anything less than that is immoral. And I would hope those people never get a chance to access patients. And I say that about patients as a physician, but hey, I'd say the same thing when it came to like a lot of the places it's being applied. I hope that people who are not thinking with that amount of care I hope they never have any access to applying AI to approving bank applications or sentencing or anything like that. This has such a huge impact on actual people's lives that, and it's completely controllable how we bring it in. And instead of just doing the minimum required, we should be thinking through like how we protect the least of these and how we really, we're really careful so that, when we use these tools, they're being used for the good. And I think it'd be a huge mistake to do it any other way.
Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Joshua, and I'm a computer science student. And I think that there's a very huge difference between human beings and computers. I believe that human consciousness exists in our spirit, and that leaves when our body leaves, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. I know a computer is nothing more than just a light switch. There's billions of light switches in a computer, in a CPU, in memory, and in other places, and they're just processing and moving around electricity and reading stuff. Besides that, a computer can only do what it was programmed to do by a human being who designed and created that computer. The computer can't have any intentions, I don't believe you can correct me, beyond what the human designer placed in the computer. So any good or evil that comes from a computer is just a tool in the hands of a designer.
So that's a really common view, and so maybe even a lot of people in the audience share that, and there's a lot of things that I agree with about that, but I do want to push on a couple things. So you're a Christian, I'm a Christian too. I believe that my consciousness is in my spirit, but what is your spirit? It's not really clear. Is it really any different than software? Software is immaterial. It's not material either. Software can exist even after the hardware is destroyed. There's a lot of pretty strong analogies between software and hardware there. That's one thing I just want to point out there. I think actually, for those people who kind of think that we don't have a spirit, well, how do you know that? We can give even a very, if you kind of think about, if the spirit is just the software, and it's kind of, we know it's there because of our consciousness, it kind of collapses to this big question of like consciousness and where does consciousness come from? So I think, I don't actually know if those statements of doctrine that are true really preclude anything that we've discussed here. The other issue too that I think that's really important to understand a lot about AI is it's not actually working how most computer programs work. It's not a set of like propositional statements that are followed kind of like in a control flow in that way. It's rather simulating a far more complex process, and what we're observing is kind of an emergent thing on top of it. And so we're saying, well, it's just a light switch. It's just a bunch of numbers going around, and that's true. But in a very analogous way, I can say that you're just like a bunch of cells that are just passing electrons back and forth. So when you die, it's all over. I could just say that same argument back to you in near perfect correspondence. And then you know that that's not true. As a Christian, we reject that. But even as a non-Christian, we should say, well, I'm not merely a bunch of electrical things bouncing around in a head. I'm more than just merely that. And so there's something going on at this other level, even though that lower level is a true description too. And that's what emergence is. That's like that gap that we have to kind of cross And so it's not clear to me at all that we can't, while it's true that computers we see today are just machines, I would say even ChatGPT, who's to say that there couldn't at some point be a spirit bestowed on silicon by God? Does God have that ability? I certainly think he does. And who's to say that God can't create a computer in the image of God? He certainly can. Who's to say that, that even though it's true that it's just a bunch of transistors, that there's something emerging on top of that that's not entirely material, that isn't fully described by the transistors, and that transcends it. I mean, I think we have more than enough reason to know that that sort of thing can happen. And will it happen in computers is a bigger question. But I don't think we know yet. Does that make any sense?
I understand what you're saying.
I would just say we could be a bit more open-handed. Like, I'm not trying to say that computers, we should have, I really don't think that anyone should have an ethical problem turning off their cell phone. Or even ChatGPT. That's not the issue. It's more something about, we could be open-handed about what the future has and what it might hold. The same way we can be open-minded about the possibility on life on other planets. Maybe, we're far more likely to, I would say we're far, far more likely to actually be able to have a conversation with a truly sentient artificial intelligence in our lifetimes than we are to encounter an intelligent alien. Maybe they're both low probability, okay? We can say it's less than 1% chance, but I'd still say it's a far greater chance of actually having that conversation with an intelligent machine than with an intelligent life on another planet. And that should make us curious.
Thank you.
Do you have anything to add? Or?
I think not. Well, I do have a different image of what the mind is, and I
different than him or different than me?
I think different from yours. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know what the mind is. So the model that I have is in part based on the physical causes of deficits. So when people have a stroke in one part of the brain, we can look at that part of the brain and see what's going to be lost. And it looks to me like what we call consciousness is built up from a collection of modular, capable systems that combine. And I don't know, but it seems that some evidence for that is that when we lose those physical systems, identifiable ones, we know which aspects of consciousness are going to disappear with them.
Okay, good. So I want to take a question from the online. So if or when artificial intelligence is able to replace a majority of people's labor to the point that people will no longer have to or be able to work, do you think that would be beneficial to society? Right? What if, sorry, things are moving around as I'm talking here. What if we are under the notion that we were actually created to labor? Would that lead to a kind of dysfunction?
Well, yes, I just don't think that that's reality. Like a common pattern. I mean, this is goes back. I mean, especially with the Industrial Revolution, this is a perennial thing. New technology happens, or comes in. People are like, oh, there's not going to be any more jobs anymore. What are you going to be able to do? And then there's a little bit more optimism now. People are like, oh, maybe we're not going to need to have jobs. I just think the reality is that we find new other things to do. That I don't really foresee. Maybe I'm totally wrong, but I don't actually foresee a workless world. I think that that at times it will be dehumanizing work, and hopefully we'll have more of the humanizing work. Is the real question, right? That's what we can hope for, and I guess we'll find out. But I don't actually think. I think we are made to work in a lot of ways. I think we get a lot of pleasure and joy out of it. But not all work is humanizing.
Well, I think there's a serious concern that human beings, human workers, could have less and less to offer to the economy, and I'm worried about what happens to people who don't find a place in the economy. I don't think they're sitting back being served by machines. I think they become the worst off members of our societies. And I think there's a real concern that the introduction of machinery, and it's the concern of the Luddites, and they weren't right. So, right, I mean, we're not doing away with spinning machines that the Luddites were smashing. And I'm not a Luddite, but I do think that the Luddites were onto a real concern, that there are people who are left behind in our economy, and they're not fictional. They're real people whose lives are marred because what they have to offer, and I think they have something to offer as human beings, because I think every human being has something crucial to offer. But what they have to offer isn't recognized as valuable by the economic systems that organize our world, and they are unfortunate.
Okay. Yeah, very good.
Hello. I had a question about your idea of embodiment. I was wondering why exactly is it that you refer to certain AI and just machines in general as not having a body if there needs to be some physical thing that enables it to to be able to process anything at all? And then in the previous question you mentioned software still existing even after hardware is destroyed. So is that how, I just can't really conceive of something existing just coming out of thin air without any sort of physical, you showed those 8 boxes on the screen. Why is that not considered a body?
Yeah, let me clarify a little more. So what I mean is that there isn't a stickiness between the hardware and the software.
So you could have a new one.
Yeah, you can just so imagine just even being. Have you guys ever seen Altered Carbon?
Mm-hmm.
It's a really great show. I mean, at least the first season. The first season was really good, and basically what happens is that it's kind of in the future. People kind of find these extinct aliens that have a special technology that allows them to jump bodies, and so it kind of severs the connection between the soul and they even use the word soul, between the soul and the body. So. Everyone gets a chip placed in the back of their neck, when they're 5 years old or something like that, and then if if their body ever dies, they can just they do that. You can also upload your consciousness somewhere, and what happens is that the wealthy start to just kind of create new bodies and bounce between bodies. They live basically forever, bouncing between bodies, and it turns into this incredibly unjust world. In which, there's a few wealthy elite that own everything, and it's like a hell on earth for everyone else, right? It's interesting too in the story because there's a lot of Catholics that decide that they are not going to actually jump between bodies, kind of as a religious conviction, and that ends up being a key plot point. What's interesting about that story is I think it really presses the question: is if that was what was going on, would those people that are how many, if they're 100 bodies later, are they even really human anymore? And I think there's something profoundly different, a different sort of relationship we'd have with who we are if we were bouncing between 100 bodies, right? Would you be really a woman? I don't know. Because if if some of the bodies you've been on are men, maybe not, right? And you could also get into synthetic bodies. You go from a biological body to a synthetic body. So there's this thing. So that's science fiction, right? And it's this, kind of the big miraculous plot device is this weird, device that allows people to jump between bodies, which we can't even really imagine as a possibility. But I think what that does is it exposes how there's it'd be something profoundly different about the human experience if we weren't bound to our bodies. You see what I'm saying? And so what I'm saying is that none of this stuff is bound to a particular body that's kind of instantiated in this world. And that, I think, makes it better understood as disembodied.
Right, okay. So, sorry to take up too much time. But is that sort of implying when we're talking about ethical considerations that this is a reason why we shouldn't necessarily give ethical considerations to computers or AI? Let's say humans could bounce between bodies. The people that do bounce between bodies, is their consciousness we shouldn't treat them?
Well, so what happens is if we had that technology and we could bounce between bodies, all of a sudden that would actually change in irrevocable ways how we treated one another's bodies.
Yeah.
All of a sudden it wouldn't be nearly quite the same cost or consequence to doing certain things now. I could take out a gun and shoot you. And that wouldn't actually be destroying some certain core aspects of who you are. Now, we could still legally legislate that that's wrong, for example, but it would have a different set of consequences, and it would start to influence our ethics, right? And that's actually what happens in this world, where like there starts to become a profound dehumanization because of this severing of the soul from the body. Now, and so we know that we're supposed to be bound in bodies, right? I think it's entirely fine that ChatGPT is not bound in a body. But if we wanted to make a conscious machine, if that was our goal, that actually we might have some ethical responsibilities to, it's possible that the path to that is by having it bound within a body, is what I'm trying to say. That would be the sort of thing that would be adding additional ingredients in. That is why we actually have the certain sort of responsibilities we have now to one another that go beyond merely can we actually have like a rational conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, so we're almost out of time, but I think we'll take one more question here.
Okay. Do I need to be in more? Or?
You're okay.
Okay. So, I've always been a really big science fiction nerd, and I've
You must be loving this conversation.
I am, yeah. And in recent years, I've also begun to really explore my spiritual side to life. And two of the things I've always thought were really important to sentience and the ability to have consciousness were the ability to learn without a specific goal and the ability to communicate ideas in your own way. But as I've also begun exploring my spiritual side, I've noticed how there is a profound intelligence in a lot of animals that I never really acknowledged before. And it gave me this question that I'd be really interested in your thoughts on, of if an AI or an animal were to become able to act in ways that we could not truly distinguish from a sentient conscious being, do we even have the right to try to arbitrate that or even ask the question of whether or not they are a person?
So we were discussing this over dinner, right?
We were, yeah.
So there's a couple things. First of all, person, I think there's levels. So first of all, actually, in the scientific community, the consensus now is that apes, the great apes, are persons. Now that doesn't mean they're human persons, and there are certain capabilities they don't have. They don't have the same ethical worth as a human, but to say that they're merely a thing is not correct, and that we'd even say in an objective sense that they have more ethical standing than a dog, even. And the other thing that came up, and I think this is actually a really important point that goes to the question of embodiment, if a chimpanzee presented itself and started communicating to us in the same way that ChatGPT was communicating, it would be a different situation entirely. Mm-hmm. We would think it was conscious, and we would think that there would be serious reconfiguration of our ethical responsibilities to that being, we thought. And because that would be different, right? I think there would be grounds to think that it actually had a mind in a way that we don't actually have with a computer, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I think that there would be major ethical responsibilities that come with that. So that's what I think. So yeah, I think that's a great exploration you're on. And animals have a worth and a value too, and we need to steward them and treat them the best we can and give them a good life. But that doesn't mean that, and they are more like us than we tend to think, especially in our modern world. But that doesn't mean that they're quite the same as a human. Like you'll never actually see a human talking like you'll never see a chimpanzee or any animal really, except for a human animal, talking like ChatGPT. And that speaks to a certain type of difference. That is an important aspect of ethical worth.